The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding, riding, riding. The highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. I'm sure a lot of you recognise that. Alfred Noyes' ultra-romantic poem, The Highwayman, complete with the dashing hero, the devoted heroine, and the dastardly King George's men. This is typical of the popular image of the highwayman, a glamorous, romantic figure we all root for. Somehow, as with pirates, the perceived romance and danger of the lifestyle seems to have given them a pass in many people's minds for the fact that they were actually robbers and murderers.
Highway robbery has, in a sense, existed since there's been travel. For example, Greek mythology is full of it. When Theseus travelled across the Isthmus of Corinth to Athens, for instance, he fought, outwitted and killed a whole series of bandits notorious for robbing and murdering travellers. Periphetes, Sinis, Sciron, Cercion, Procrustes. And this is echoed in many other legends and tales from ancient times. In the stories of King Arthur's knights, innocent travellers are forever being assaulted by rogue knights and having to be rescued by Lancelot or one of his colleagues. And needless to say, highway robbery was as rife in Hertfordshire as anywhere else. All these early tales, from Theseus to King Arthur, cast the robbers as the villains, ultimately killed by the story's hero. From the Middle Ages onwards, though, a curious thing happened. The robbers themselves became the heroes of the stories. This was happening everywhere from Iceland to China, but the best known of all was from England. And Hertfordshire's first recorded highway robber was from this period, although his authenticity is highly dubious. There are many legends of medieval outlaws preying on travellers along the roads. In the earliest versions of the Robin Hood legend, for instance, Robin controlled the road through Barnesdale in southern Yorkshire, although this was later moved further south to Sherwood Forest, where he forced travellers to pay a toll for using the route. Hertfordshire's earliest outlaw legend, still commemorated in his home village, refers to the giant Jack-a-Legs of Weston, who robbed travellers on the Great North Road at Gravely. Like Robin, Jack tended to distribute some of his gains for the poor and was always ready to fight for the rights of the oppressed, particularly against the bakers of Baldock, who were notorious for giving short measure. Also like Robin, Jack was a prodigious archer. His final bow shot, after he'd been tricked and betrayed to his death, was made from the middle of Baldock and ended up hitting Weston Church. It's all true. As with Robin Hood, the legend of Jack-a-Legs may have its origin in a historical figure. One theory suggests that the story may have been inspired by Richard de Clare, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, who was nicknamed Strongbow, and who, among many other places, was Lord of Weston. Neither Jack nor Robin was a genuine highwayman, though. The golden age of the highwayman was still to come. The golden age of the highwayman was a roughly 150-year period from the Civil War to the end of the 18th century. In fact, there were two types of highway robbers. If they were mounted, they were referred to as highwaymen. If they were on foot, they were footpads. In general, the popular figures were the highwaymen, who, in the early days at least, were often gentlemen as opposed to the more plebeian footpads. Some were also highway women, at least in popular imagination, from the traditional ballad Sauve to Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders, and, as we'll see, one of Hertfordshire's earliest highwaymen. Early on, many highwaymen were sons of the gentry supplementing the family fortunes, or else royalist soldiers who turned to a life of crime after the king's defeat, either to make a living in an unfriendly environment or as an act of rebellion against the Commonwealth. It's interesting that this is a close parallel to the aftermath of the American Civil War, because many of the outlaws of the Wild West were actually former Confederate soldiers. Over time, however, the social class of the typical highwayman diminished, and very few, if any, of the well-known gentlemen of the road were actually gentlemen by birth, though one was a genuine gentlewoman of the road. Hertfordshire had its fair share of both highwaymen and footpads. They operated all over the country's roads, but as with Jack-o'-legs, the Great North Road was a particularly tempting target. Many travellers found themselves held up, a fact commemorated by the Highwayman pub at Gravely. Some of Hertfordshire's highway robbers came from the county, while others, including the most famous of them all, operated at times within its borders. Few highwaymen died in their beds, though, and those arrested in Hertfordshire or brought back to answer for their crimes here were tried and executed in Hertford. Most of these were hanged up on Gallows Hill, which of course is now the site of a McDonald's. That seems somehow appropriate. And in fact, the last execution ever held on Gallows Hill was of a highwayman.
The earliest significant example of a highwayman, as we know it in Hertfordshire, was actually a highwaywoman, although there's no clear evidence that she actually was a highway robber at all. Lady Catherine Ferrers was a young heiress, born in the mid-1630s, who was married at the age of 12 or 13, the records disagree, to her stepfather's cousin, who himself was only 16. This appears to have been largely in order to restore the fortunes of the groom's family, and the young couple seem to have spent very little time together. According to the story, Catherine went to live at her family's house, Markyate Cell, formerly a priory, with her mother and an aunt.
But by the time she was 18, they'd both died, leaving her alone. This was during the Commonwealth, and the strongly royalist family might have found it tough to make ends meet. But it's also likely that young Catherine, as a teenager, was bored. It was in this situation, so the legend says, that she came under the spell of Ralph Chaplin, a local farmer who was also a highwayman by night. He taught her the tricks of the trade, which she took to enthusiastically, but she also seems to have been besotted with Ralph. When he was shot dead during a robbery, Catherine's reign of terror began. The Wicked Lady, as she became known, terrorised travellers, often shooting them without provocation as well as robbing them. But she also burnt down houses and killed cattle. Eventually, during a robbery on No Man's Land Common, which is between Wheathampstead and Sandridge, she was shot and mortally wounded by one of her intended victims. Catherine made it back to Markyate Cell, but was found dead outside in the morning. Although for reasons the legend doesn't make clear, Catherine was buried at Ware, right on the other side of the county, the Wicked Lady's ghost was frequently seen around Markyate Cell and on the roads all around, riding a spectral white horse. The legend says that her treasure is buried outside the house, but of course no one's ever found it. In fact, there's no real evidence that any of the story is true. The legend isn't recorded until a couple of centuries later, And Markyate Cell itself was actually leased out to tenants throughout Catherine's life. Still, the image of the highwaywoman is, if anything, even more potent than that of the highwayman. And the legend of the Wicked Lady has inspired a novel, a classic film, and a less classic remake, an episode of Doctor Who, and of course the name of a pub on the edge of No Man's Land Common. Now, if there's one figure who sums up the popular image of the dashing gentleman highwayman, it would be James Whitney, though he wasn't a gentleman by birth. Born in Stevenage in 1660, he was a butcher's apprentice in Hitchin and then ran the George Inn in Cheshunt, either the one that stood beside the police station until recently or a predecessor, until he turned to a life of crime. Whitney quickly became the leader of a gang of highwaymen that varied in size but was at times said to number up to 80. Dressing finely and affecting a courteous, generous manner, when it suited him at least, stories about Captain Whitney quickly became popular. Perhaps the most audacious exploit of Whitney's gang was to rob the Duke of Marlborough of 500 guineas, a massive sum at the time, at London Colney, although it cost the lives of 10 of the highwaymen. 2 years earlier, though, in 1690, they'd had an even more successful haul at South Mimms, where they robbed a London-bound convoy of £15,000 in taxes from the Midlands. Eventually, Whitney was caught in London and hanged at Tyburn in 1693 after delivering a penitent speech from the gallows. However, tales of his cleverness and generosity abounded, including one where, having robbed a man who lamented that he had a long way to go and knew no one to help him, Whitney opened the bag of gold and told him to take back what he needed. And his image was also aided, like Robin Hood's, by painting his victims as deserving to be robbed, such as one well-known story where the victim was a miserly usurer. It's said that the character Captain Tom Faggus from R.D. Blackmore's Lorna Doone was based on Whitney. My favourite anecdote about James Whitney, though, is a curious tale from when he was a butcher's apprentice in Hitchin. His master coveted a prize calf whose owner refused to sell, so Whitney offered to steal it from its stall during the night. Unfortunately, for Whitney at least, the farmer got wind of this, borrowed a dancing bear from a man in the town and put it in the stall in place of the calf. When Whitney broke in, let's just say it was bear 1, Whitney 0. Remarkably, this doesn't seem to have put Whitney off a life of crime, as you might assume it would have done. Now, the most famous highwayman of them all was mostly associated with Essex, but his activities did spill over into Hertfordshire. Dick Turpin started his criminal career as part of a gang of deer thieves, who later took to burglary, but he eventually graduated to highway robbery. While most of Turpin's crimes were committed in Essex and what's now North London, there were 2 recorded cases where he was operating in Hertfordshire. During one of these periods, he narrowly avoided arrest at an inn in Hertford, which is thought to have been the Old Vine. According to the story, Turpin had arranged to meet his wife at the pub, but was recognised. He very romantically made his escape through the window, but a bit less romantically left his wife behind to face the music. Turpin was hanged in York in 1739 for horse stealing, but his celebrated ride to York, like most of his legend, was a later invention, much of it coming from William Harrison Ainsworth's 1834 novel Rookwood. It's not known precisely how Turpin travelled to York, but the famous episode was actually borrowed from an earlier exploit by William Nevinson in 1676. Nevinson committed a robbery in Kent and then rode at full speed to York and immediately showed himself off very prominently in public. This led to the conclusion that he couldn't possibly have committed the crime in Kent and got to York in the available time. And curiously, this was a strategy that was also used much later in America by the James gang, Frank and Jesse James. However, Nevinson's only Hertfordshire connection was that he presumably rode through the county on the Great North Road on his way to York. Most of the tales of notorious highway robbers, in Hertfordshire as elsewhere, involved a supposedly dashing mounted highwayman. One of the most reviled, however, was a footpad, Walter Clibborn, sometimes spelt Clibborn with an R, the pie man of Hertford. Now, during the 18th century, a number of footpads were operating in the vicinity of Hertford. One of the most notorious routes was the road across Hertford Heath. There are records, for example, of a Hertford woolcomber named Jonathan Smart being robbed there in 1717, and a grocer called Bentley in 1790, and many others. But Clibborn's reign of terror marked the worst period of all. Hertford had not only a weekly Saturday market at the time, but also 4 annual fairs: on Passion Sunday in Lent, on the Feast of St. John the Baptist, the 24th of June, the Nativity of the Virgin Mary on the 8th of September, and the Feast of St. Simon and St. Jude on the 28th of October. Fairs attracted traders, farmers and buyers from far and wide, and many of the traders and farmers set off home at the end of the day considerably richer than when they arrived. Unfortunately, not all of them reached home with their new wealth. During the later part of the 18th century, many were set on and robbed by a gang of footpads bundled up in smocks and with faces blackened by soot. If the victim was lucky, they merely lost everything, but some, like a farmer named Kent from Bennington, tried to put up a fight and were murdered. What baffled everyone was that only those who'd done particularly well at the fair were targeted. The gang appeared to have inside information. It finally came to a head on the 28th of December 1782, when the gang attacked a farmer's son from Datchworth, who was driving a cart through the woods west of Hertford. The young man sensibly let them take his money and escaped with his life, but then he headed straight for his uncle's home nearby at Queen Hoo Hall. The uncle, Benjamin Wittenbury, set out with the young man and a servant to track down the gang. At Oaken Valley Bottom, the 3 of them were set upon by 3 robbers. The fighting was going against Wittenbury's group when the servant managed to get in a close-range shot that killed the robber leader, at which his accomplices fled. Finally unmasked, the dead leader turned out to be one Walter Clibborn of Babs Green, Wareside, who sold pies at Hertford's fairs and market. Wandering around with his pie tray had enabled him to snoop unnoticed and gain intelligence about who was doing particularly well. One of Clibborn's accomplices was arrested and hanged on Gallows Hill after trial at the Lent Assizes, though the other was never seen again. As for Clibborn, his body was buried by the road at Oaken Valley Bottom, with a post that can still be seen, although I believe it's a replacement actually, stuck into his grave, which was to prevent his ghost from walking. This seems to have worked, since as far as anyone knows, his ghost has never troubled travellers in the lanes around Hertford. A number of highwaymen, real and fictional, were referred to as the flying highwaymen, a sobriquet referring to the habit of escaping capture by leaping their horses over turnpikes. Various broadside ballads of the late 18th and early 19th centuries refer to such a figure called Morgan, although there's no record of a highwayman of that name. However, these were after the hanging on Hertford's Gallows Hill of a genuine flying highwayman, William Harrow. The account of Harrow's career in the Newgate calendar begins in a thoroughly moralising way, although giving annoyingly little personal detail. We're told that he commenced his career in idleness, the parent vice. Then he became dexterous at throwing at cocks and cockfighting. These cruel and infamous acquirements led to robberies, adultery, and every other deadly sin. Such is the general course of the highwaymen and their goal, the gallows. Feels somehow appropriate to be delivering a homily like that here. Harrow seems to have begun as a poacher. A confrontation with the gamekeeper of a gentleman near Hatford, again annoyingly not named, led to his incarceration in Hertford jail. He escaped and had a reward of £50 offered for his capture, a large sum at the time. He took to highway robbery, and although no details of specific robberies are recorded, it was noted that many took place in the neighbourhood of St Albans. With a gang consisting of Thomas Jones and William Bosford, he also diversified into burglary. They robbed the home of an old farmer called Thomas Glasscock, attempting what was essentially an 18th century version of the police officer scam, turning up on your doorstep dressed as a police officer. Can I come in? I want to investigate a crime. But like all of us, hopefully, the victim wasn't fooled. So they forced their way in anyway and made off with £300, having tied up Glasscock and his housekeeper. Harrow took his share of the booty to Gloucestershire, but soon got in trouble there. Having been linked with Hertfordshire's flying highwayman, he was taken into custody and returned to Hertford jail along with Jones and Bosford. In fact, he nearly escaped again. When the jailer came to escort him to his execution, he'd almost succeeded in sawing off his irons. He was just too late, though, and Harrow, Jones and Bosford were hanged on Gallows Hill on the 28th of March 1773. The Newgate calendar records that a certain John Wright was hanged along with them for highway robbery on the Buntingford Road. But unfortunately, I've been able to find nothing else about Wright's career. And of course, the name John Wright is annoyingly common. William Harrow was the earliest person to be given the name of the flying highwayman, and it's tempting to think that those popular ballads were actually about him. On a grassy hill in Boxmoor stands a grave to Robert Snooks, the last man to be hanged for highway robbery in England. In fact, there's some dispute about whether he really was the last, and even his name is wrong. He was actually, as you can see from the plaque, called James Snook, but he was commonly known as Robber Snook, which seems to have mutated into the name by which he's now popularly known. Although he was born in Berkshire and most of his crimes were committed further west, Snook's fatal robbery was committed in 1801 on Boxmoor. There he robbed a postboy of banknotes and promissory notes to the value of £80. Snook came under suspicion, but as the robbery had taken place in the dark, the postboy couldn't positively identify him. However, having gone to London, Snook made the mistake of trying to spend one of the higher denomination banknotes, which was then traced back to as one of the stolen ones. He was arrested and held at Hertford jail, and then tried and found guilty. Since his crimes didn't actually include murder, he might have expected a sentence of transportation, particularly since at the time the courts were making a real effort to get able-bodied people to send to Australia. However, the judge considered his crime to be of a nature so destructive to society and the commercial interests to the country that he was sentenced to death. The sentence was carried out on Boxmoor under the old principle of hanging a criminal as close as possible to the scene of the crime. Large crowds turned out, eager to see the spectacle, which prompted Snook to comment to the hurrying, jostling crowd, "It's no good hurrying. They can't start the fun until I get there." Snook was buried on Boxmoor, and a headstone was erected in 1904, although the location is approximate, as no exact record exists of where the grave was. Nevertheless, the monument has proved surprisingly popular, and the estate manager's house of the Boxmoor Trust is rather aptly named Snook's End. Snook may or may not have been the last person hanged for highway robbery, but he was certainly one of the last. This wasn't only down to more lenient sentences, though. Mounted highway robbery was becoming less attractive, what with mounted patrols increasing and toll roads hampering escape. The crucial reason, though, can be seen in Snook's downfall. Whereas plunder in the form of gold and jewellery was difficult to trace, by the early 19th century, paper money was becoming widely used, and, as James Snook found to his cost, that all too easily led straight to the robber. In Hertfordshire, as elsewhere, highway robbery declined through the 19th century. The advent of motor vehicles made it virtually obsolete. After all, who's going to stand in front of a car doing 70 on the motorway and demand, "Stand or deliver"? Only once, at least. Perhaps the only genuine type of highway robbery still surviving is car theft in service stations, a far cry from Turpin, Witney or Ferrers. Needless to say, this is a good thing, not only because it makes life safer, though of course there are plenty of other ways of being robbed or attacked, but also because it enables us to enjoy the unrealistically romantic figure of the highwayman without the inconvenience. Time casts a golden glow over the most unacceptable matters, and Hertfordshire highway robbers like Catherine Ferrers, James Whitney, Dick Turpin, Walter Clibborn, William Harrow and James Snook, as well as many more obscure figures, provide legends we can enjoy at a safe distance.